So let's talk about Briar in the Pokemon trading card game. So Briar is a new card that is going to be released in the new set from Stellar Miracle, and the card reads as following. You could play this card only if your opponent has 2 prize cards remaining. Until the end of this turn, if your opponent's active Pokemon is knocked out by damage from one of your Terra Pokemon's attacks, take 1 more prize card. Now, here's a few things to note. This card can only be used when your opponent has 2 prize cards remaining. Terra Pokemon must be the one to knock out the opponent's active Pokemon, and keep in mind that the prize card effect can only be applied to the opponent's active Pokemon, meaning that if you're planning on using Dragapult EX's bench snipe, you won't get an extra prize if you fail to knock out the active and end up knocking out the bench instead. So, let's talk about the pros and cons here. The pros is, historically, cards that take extra prizes have been very strong. Iron Hands EX, ADP, GX, all very powerful cards, and generally speaking, in a situation, with that in mind, you could easily come back from a losing position and just win the game from there. It also opens a lot more options for Terra decks going first, as well as making the single prize route potentially appealing, because they will, if your opponent ends up taking the odd prize route, well, you could just play Briar, and then once you attack when they are at 2 prize cards left and you're at 3, and your opponent has an EX right in front of you, just play Briar and you basically win the game. And on top of the fact that it's also a supporter, it's quite easy to search out. Pidgeot EX and the Minion V are cards that do exist, and so same with Pokegear 3.0. So it's not going to be a hard card to find. Now, the cons. Generally speaking, this is a pretty big con. This card can only be used if your opponent has 2 prize cards exactly. So oftentimes in other situations, if you have this card in your hand and you don't get Ionode, this card is just going to be a brick. This card can also only be used by Terra Pokemon, meaning that thankfully, it's nothing like an Iron Hands cannot take like 4 prize cards potentially. No, it has to be used by something like a Charizard EX, or a Dragapult EX. Those with the Terra type on it. Now, it's also quite easy to play around if your opponent can just go the odd prize route to avoid this effect. On top of the fact that more control-oriented decks that don't knock out that do not knock out any Pokemon are in the meta, are also in the meta and viable strategies as well. So, and finally, this is actually kind of a big point. Because of the restriction that it can only be used if your opponent has 2 prize cards, all Terra Pokemon are 2 prizers. Thus, if you do not finish the game right then and there, you will very likely lose, unless your name is Frostless EX and you flip heads, in which case I guess you could stall out for an additional turn. So yeah, generally speaking, I think this card... now the next question is this card toxic? Well, honestly, this card is compared heavily with Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia GX. As well as Iron Hands. Generally speaking, being able to take a extra prize is a very powerful effect. Altered Creation, it was... but the situation is that with ADP GX, that effect was comparatively really easy to set up. At the time, in your turn 1, if you're playing ADP Zacian, you just attach 1 Metal Energy to ADP using either an attach for turn or through Intrepid Sword, thanks to Zacian V. There are many ways that you could actually manipulate your deck in that deck for you to get the Metal Energy. And secondly, after that, you just attach a Water Energy to ADP and then use Altered Creation, and then boom, you have the effect. But Altered Creation, not only did it allow you to take an extra prize card, it also had a secondary effect that permanently gave you 30 plus damage, and quite honestly, with those two effects combined, I personally think it was a bit overkill. During that time, cards like Crobat V and Dedenne were popular in the format. So what you would do is altered creation, boss's orders, take out the Dedenne, boss's orders, take out the Crobat, win game from there. So it just accelerated the game to the point where three attacks would finish the game right then and there. So honestly, in my opinion, Briar is powerful, but it requires significantly more setup and is applicable in a lot less scenarios to win the game compared to, say, ADP. If you do play this card, it is an absolute I must win. Otherwise, I would most likely lose because my opponent would be in a good position to knock out my Terramon afterwards. Also, keep in mind that stall and control decks basically functionally make this card useless, and it would be very difficult to pull it off at that point as well. I will say that this card is best ran in Charizard EX, but I also know that discussing with a few people, Dragapult will also be able to make good use of this card as well. Until I actually looked at the next set, Shrouded Fable, and actually, you know what, I have to take back what I said. No, this card is really, really strong. Shrouded Fable has yet to come out internationally, but already I'm seeing Japanese lists that run the new Dusclops and Dusknoir card, and they're running it on Charizard decks, and the effect is nuts. Its effect allows you to knock itself out while placing from 5 damage counters if you're a Dusclops and 13 damage counters if you're a Dusknoir. Knock itself out, place 5 to 13 damage or 13 damage counters onto one of your opponent's Pokemon. With this, prize manipulation got significantly easier with this because the card states that as long as you play Briar at 2 prize cards, you basically get the effect. And with this now, even if your opponent tries their best to manipulate the prize mapping for you, with these cards, you don't have to really worry about that as much anymore. And plus, knocking itself out, having less prize cards for your opponent, makes your Charizards do a lot more attack, and placing damage counters as an ability is also very powerful, potentially getting you that extra knockout and prize. So, in conclusion, I think this card will have a significant impact, and it will be very, very strong. The fact that this card exists will automatically shift how people play against Terra-type decks, especially Charizard, even if they're not running it. With a format where you don't know your opponent's deck list, this card will always be in the back of your opponent's mind, regardless if it's ran or not. It is definitely not a toxic card still, in my opinion, but it is very strong and should be considered, and in my opinion, should be ran in every single Charizard EX deck. The inclusion of Dusclops and Dusknoir further improves this card's impact, and generally speaking, would make Charizard EX, in my opinion, the best deck in the format. Anyways, that is all I have to say. Thank you so much for listening, and let me know what you think. Tell me I'm wrong, or say that you agree. It's up to you, really. Anyways, have a good one. Take care.